Welcome everyone to the latest edition of GrowthChat. We are super excited to have Johan Fourie today, who is at Stellenbosch University, where he is professor of economics. And Johan has written a book that will come out in 4 weeks' time. That's entitled Our Long Walk to Economic Freedom, Lessons from 100,000 Years of Human History. And Johan, thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me here, Sascha and Marco.
So maybe you could start off by giving us a brief summary of what the book is about.
Sure. Our Long Walk to Economic Freedom is an accessible and I hope also perhaps an entertaining introduction to global economic history, with the specific focus from Africa. So I teach in Stellenbosch in South Africa, and the purpose really is to tell a global economic history story over thousands of years from this perspective. So the book starts really with a chapter where we begin with kind of ancient human paintings and trying to understand kind of the process of how humans developed art and art forms and then migrated out of Africa. And it ends really with a chapter on South Africa again, and what we've seen over the last 2 decades happening in South Africa, and the final chapter is of course a look into the future. So it covers all kinds of interesting, I think, topics that relate to both kind of economic events, but also kind of major social, political change. And often it shows, I think, that many of these things that we think of as kind of social or political events are often underpinned by economic factors. So that's part of the attempt also, is to show that, you know, many things that we tend to think we have the understanding of is actually there's something very fundamentally perhaps wrong with our understanding, or there are other factors that we haven't considered yet, and so that's really part of what the aim of the book was about. So I think it's you know, it's useful to have a book where there are obviously several other types of introductions to global economic history, but I think often when you read these, they are written from very much a European perspective, and the attempt here is really to kind of position Africa to the center of the story, and tell global economic history from this perspective.
Yeah, I found that truly refreshing, not to see all the talk about, say, the Glorious Revolution and whatever big events there were in Europe only, but also to see that African perspective. That was really great. But then tell us a bit more about the structure of the book. So it has quite a number of chapters. So that is, I guess, part of your attempt to make it entertaining, so that one doesn't feel like, oh, this is a really long chapter, maybe I'd rather read it next week. But instead it's brief, crisp. So it's like one a day, you could say.
Yeah, I guess you can put it next to your bed and read one every night, right? It's about 2,500 words a chapter. Partly it's because the book is based on a course that I've been teaching for the last decade or so, and you know, to get students, undergraduate students, to read more than 2,500 words per lecture is challenging. So it's really based on these kind of lectures, and also the kind of the challenge. It's probably part of the lessons that I learned is to kind of limit yourself to 2,000 or 2,500 words when you write about the Industrial Revolution. Is quite a difficult thing, right? You need to really kind of be as succinct as possible. So it also depends on, you know, what is really important, and perhaps some things are kind of less important, and so you can leave them out. And that was really kind of that's something that I really enjoyed about writing the book. But it also allows you to write about many types of different topics. So you're right, there's in the new updated version that's coming out with Cambridge University Press, there's 36 chapters now. So there's an additional new chapter, but many of the other chapters have actually expanded based on previous comments that I received on the South African version of the book. So I think it's still crisp, but I think it's slightly more comprehensive than the earlier version. I think it provides, I think, also a great introduction to a broad set of topics, where some of them I'm sure most listeners would be familiar with, but some of them are pretty unique, and perhaps, if there's there's a chapter, for example, on an Indonesian volcano and how that shapes events in Europe, but also events in Southern Africa. And I'm pretty sure many listeners would not have thought about the effects of Tambora before they've read this chapter. So that's really the purpose, is to expose an audience to some new interesting stories from global economic history.
Yeah, I really like that. Now, why did you write that book? There are cases where people say, oh, someone told me you really should write a book. And other people say, I always wanted to write a book. So what category are you?
I guess I've always wanted to write a book. It's very curious, because the publisher that commissioned me, Michael Watson, met with me in New York in January 2020, just before COVID locked all of us down. And I had pitched a book to Michael, which is completely different to the one that I wrote 2 months later. But when lockdown came, obviously all our courses had to move online. And I just realized that my students won't get the same experience that they usually would get from my classes, because it's quite interactive. We have debates about kind of, contentious topics, and doing that online is really difficult to do. And so I decided to write summaries of my chapters to the students. And when I got to basically chapter 15 or 20, I realized, well, these summaries, the students really enjoy them. And potentially, they could reach a much broader audience than just these students. And so I had a friend who was in the publishing industry in South Africa, and so I approached some South African publishers, again with the aim, basically, because this would be an interesting book that would reach other South Africans, and they would find this interesting. I never even thought of actually pitching this to an international publisher. And after it came out in 2021 in South Africa, the book did really well. It was a commercial success here. And so I then again sent Michael an email saying perhaps Cambridge might be interested in this, and they were. So that's fantastic. The book would now reach a kind of a global audience and not just South African. So I think those are kind of that's the practical or the proximate reason for why I wrote the book. But I think a more fundamental reason would be that I've been teaching this course for about a decade, and my sense is that students have become incredibly pessimistic about the future, and there's good reason for that. In South Africa, we've had a decade of poor growth and even negative growth for many years in kind of recent years. So the students that are now in my class, I think many listeners would find this strange, but they don't remember the 2010 World Cup. For them, that's ancient history, right? They were 6 years old, so they hardly remember it. And South Africa is a completely different country after 2010 than before 2010. And so the South Africa that they grew up in is one of pessimism, of negative growth, of poor prospects. So it's understandable that they are negative, but my sense is also that this is a generational thing. It's not only South Africans that are negative about the future or pessimistic. And so I thought, to write a book where I can tell a more optimistic story, because if you are an economic historian, inevitably you must be an optimist, right? The incredible change that we've seen over the last 2 centuries suggests that there's wonderful things that have happened, and potentially also good things that can happen if we obviously learn from those kind of lessons. So I thought that's necessary. It's a necessary book, and ultimately I think the way it came together is it's a book that where only I could write those stories. It sounds a bit strange, but many of those stories is my own experience are infused in them. I travel to many of those places that I write about, and so it's a very personal book in many ways as well. And so it felt like something that had to be produced, if I can put it that way. And so I'm very, very kind of proud of the ultimate product.
I must say that as the young generation of South Africans don't remember the World Cup in 2010, I would like to forget that World Cup, given how bad Italy performed in that World Cup. So I'm joining the group there. You have a lot of chapters in the book, and you talk about different stories. I'm curious to know, what is your favorite one?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. I mean, I've got many favorites. I think the one that most people enjoy is the one where I talk about this, family, or this kind of group of friends really, that go and spend the summer on Lake Geneva, and then it's terrible weather, and Mary Shelley is part of this group, and she writes Frankenstein, and then it's not only bad weather in Europe, it's bad weather in Asia and America and also Southern Africa. And then I talk about the volcano and all the kind of massive disruption and chaos that happens with Shaka and the Zulu, and how that kind of ultimately also creates the conditions for the Great Trek and shapes South Africa's future basically for the next 200 years. And ultimately these events are tied by this Indonesian volcano. So it's a really kind of nice story where many of the things that we think about, we understood the kind of social, again, political, cultural, perhaps reasons, even for religious reasons for events, ultimately are underpinned by these resource constraints that are created by an Indonesian volcano. So I really like how that story is tied together. And I think many readers have kind of pointed it out. But I think that the one thing I would add is that there were chapters that I really didn't want to write. So I have no real interest in the global financial crisis, for example. I've not done any research on it. I guess I knew nothing more than the kind of average guy on the street. And yet writing that chapter, I think that chapter came together quite nicely in the end. And again, that's partly, I mentioned that this is infused with my own story, but, it was in 2018, my wife and I did a trip of Iceland, and so I started the story in Iceland, and then it ends with kind of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and I just thought that it was a nice story to tell in the end, even though I left that chapter actually to last. That was the final one I had to write, and I thought it kind of ended up quite nicely. So I don't think it's necessarily my favorite chapter, but I'm quite proud of how that turned out.
So you wrote it for the students first, but aside from people that have an economic background, what do you think people with a not economic background would like the most? You mentioned something.
I think the idea that history is often, when people think of history, certainly my friends that I have, we very much think of political history. So it's like this kind of classic thing of just one damn fact, or it's various kings and this kind of thing, or revolutions. But to me, I mean, history is much more than that, right? So I in part of my own research, I focus a lot on like quantitative history and telling social history, for example, even political history, but with data. And then you talk not about these kind of major events, but you talk about the lives of ordinary people. And when I teach economic history, that's partly also what I want to do. It's not, economic history is not just some Federal Reserve announcement or some major event that kind of shocks everything and then things are different. It's again understanding the kind of lives of ordinary people. And so I think actually the audience for this book is the people that are inquisitive about the world, right? So it's I mean, that's quite broad, of course. And students are, or we hope that they should be inquisitive, right? So that's partly why I think students would enjoy this and why I think it would be a great undergraduate textbook. But but I think more than that, right? I walk often. I'm often on airports and in airport bookshops, and I look at the kind of books that are there, and I find some of the kind of really interesting things that I've read are actually just things that are quite accessible on these, especially in fields that I know very little about. So that's what I also hope, is that there would be a kind of a broader audience for the book that are inquisitive about global economic history, or global history really, and especially then this angle that it's written from an African perspective, so you would get stories that are told in slightly different ways, and especially in connecting disparate parts of the world in ways that you haven't thought about that before, right? So when there's a chapter, for example, on the Indian Ocean, where we talk about India, and we talk about the Middle East, and we talk about East Africa, and tying that all together in a way that perhaps people haven't done before. Or there's a new chapter, for example, on war that is all about, which starts in Poland, but it connects ultimately with Mozambique, which I think is connections that people don't typically make. And so that's really the I think the aim of this book, is to provide this kind of global economic history to an audience of people that are interested in the world, and would want to understand perhaps the connections between these events that I haven't thought of before.
You mentioned about the GFC. So of all the topics that you cover, I'm sure something was new even for you that you needed to learn. What did you learn overall? There was something specific that, okay, that's something definitely I didn't know, and I'm just discovering now. Yeah,
I think the first thing I learned was that I made a lot of mistakes in my class because I was teaching. I had several anecdotes which I thought was true, and then when I started researching them for the book, I realized that they're perhaps not as true as I thought they were. So I certainly corrected a lot of my kind of errors. Yeah, sure. I learned a lot. So I mean, especially because most of the teaching that I'd done was kind of for the first half of the course. Often there would be guest lectures for the second half. So especially in the latter chapters on Latin America, on Asia, on Russia, there's a lot of literature that I had to go through to make sure that I've got the essence of the story, right? Again, to try to distill this vast literature into 2,000 or 2,500 words is quite tricky, and you have to decide ultimately. It's a bigger decision about what to leave out than what to put in. And of course, the literature is also changing frequently. So there's, I would write this. I wrote this in 2020, the first edition, and then the second edition. In late 2021 could update this, and there were already kind of new papers that were out that I thought might be even more interesting than the ones that I included before. And so it's deciding what is necessary to tell a kind of a gripping story was quite tricky. So I guess there were many lessons, but I would say it's really about the kind of global experiences of the 20th century that I learned a lot more than I knew before. So I'll stick to that.
Now we talked about the audience that might genuinely be interested in pick your book anyways in a bookshop. But if you could think of people you would really want to read the book, people where you say a politician, where you say, this person ought to read this, and chapter X would be really important to read. Who would that be? Or what would you want the world to know that they don't get yet, but what your book conveys?
Yeah, sure. I think the person I have in mind when I wrote this book is someone who has been, and I should choose my words carefully now, but someone who has been exposed almost entirely in their training to a pessimistic story of the last century of, if I can put it that way, capitalism, although the word capitalism doesn't really feature in the book. But when I said before, economic historians have a positive story to tell. I really believe that, and the data supports that, right? It's not just a belief is probably the wrong word. It's a belief engendered really in the data, in what we see, in how humans have flourished, right? Longer lives, better lives, wealthier, more meaningful lives, even over the last century or two. And it started in England, of course, but it spread globally, and it's even in the poorest parts of the world. My own continent is 6 times more affluent than it was 200 years ago. So and there's many more of us. So it is a positive story, and yet I think students in certain parts of the university are not exposed to that positive story. So I would teach often. I would give a guest lecture in the humanities faculty, and then I would find students afterwards come to me and say, "Why have we never heard this story being told?" And to me, that is shocking, really. There's no other way of putting it. That there must be at least somewhere in the curriculum for those students. I'm not saying that should be the only story that they hear, but there must be somewhere in the curriculum that message should be communicated. And so that's really the purpose of my book, is to really reach those, I guess, students that are pessimistic, and because of their experience, but then also they are fed further this pessimism that there is no solution to the stagnation that you're experiencing, or the kind of low growth, or the poor prospects, and that's just not true. So I hope to, if I could choose one audience, then that would be it. I guess also in South Africa, we have a political party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, and yet my definition of what economic freedom is would be very different, I think, to what they would be fighting for. Although our ultimate aim, I guess, is similar, right? Is to see people prosper, and yet the way I think we get there is very different. And hopefully, the book I had hoped that the book would lead to some kind of conversation. It hasn't yet, but hopefully in future it will.
Now, the final question is a more personal one. So what you also tell in the book is part of your own family history. And some of your ancestors were Huguenots who fled from France when they were persecuted, went to Amsterdam, and then ultimately made their way to South Africa. And I was wondering how that has influenced you as a person, but also as a researcher and the person writing this particular book.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. How family history is, I think people forget how popular family history is, right? Genealogical research is the #1 hobby globally. So there's a lot of interest in family history, and there's a reason for that, because it provides some identity. It gives you a place, it positions you in time. And so someone that is interested in history will ultimately want to understand their own family history as well. So certainly that has certainly been something that of interest to me. And about 2 months ago, I gave my inaugural lecture here at Stellenbosch University, where I used my own family history to tell the story of South Africa. And that was it was a wonderful thing for me to be able to do, because I sit on these large data sets of South Africa, so I can really tell an interesting kind of quantitative history that I think not many people would be able to do. So that's really interesting. I think I do think the benefit I see of understanding kind of my own roots is really to help me understand, I guess, also the rich context in which I live. So South Africa is a country with incredible diversity, and the part of that is the challenge is to of course to live together in harmony and in unity within this kind of incredible diversity. But it provides you, I think, with an understanding of the richness of the country, and an understanding also of where we then are and how difficult it's been to get here, right? So you find yourself in the records as a slave owner, right? You find yourself in the records as an indigenous person. And so all of these people ultimately fuse into who you are today, and their stories are kind of combined. So whereas we, I think, often try to stereotype people perhaps today, I think what understanding your own history is, it really makes it quite clear that, history is complicated, and you are then in fact part of that complicated history. So, being a refugee is part of my history. Being a slave owner is part of the history. Being an indigenous person is part of that history. And ultimately that makes you it gives you a far more, I think, better sensitivity to South Africa's challenges today than if you were just kind of, unaware of that and having to create your own identity in the present. So I think that's perhaps the most useful way of thinking about family history. Of course, I think we're very fortunate because we have these genealogical records that go back, 10 generations or so. And not many are so fortunate, but that is the benefit of historical, deep historical research.
Thank you so much, Johan. That was a fantastic interview. We were very happy to have you, and we can only hope that you sell many, many copies of your book, which is really highly recommended, and it's going to come out early August, hopefully. And thanks again, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Sascha. Thanks, Marco.
Thanks, Johan, and thanks, Sascha, for running the interview. I'll see you at the next one.